Talks over Ukraine's future security are hardening into a transatlantic rift. The US is pushing a controversial plan for a Korea-style demilitarized zone, while Europe fears it would trap them with the burden of policing a frozen conflict. The proposal, floated by Washington as part of a quick-fix peace plan, would effectively cement Russian gains and sideline NATO expansion, while leaving Ukraine with little more than a mined buffer zone in place of real sovereignty. Talks over Ukraine's future security have recently intensified. Still, a significant rift has emerged between the US and its European allies over who will shoulder the long-term burden of the war-torn country's defense. A final framework for security assurances remains elusive, with the disagreements exposing a fundamental divide on the path forward. The Kyiv Post, citing diplomatic sources, reported on August 28th that the US officials have recently floated a controversial peace proposal centered on a demilitarized zone, DMZ, a concept that has not been well received by European counterparts. A Western diplomat told Kyiv Post on August 26th that the Europeans were not awfully fond of the idea, signaling deep-seated concerns that it would leave them to police a fragile peace alone. In the meantime, a retired US Army colonel with NATO experience suggests it could provide the only path to peace, despite widespread opposition. Retired US Army Colonel Richard Williams, who once served as Deputy Director of the Armaments Section in NATO's Defense Investment Division, as per Kyiv Post, offers a bleak assessment of what he calls the elusive post-conflict security guarantees for Ukraine and Europe. Williams argues that, given Vladimir Putin's restrictions, credible security guarantees for Ukraine are almost impossible to find. He points out that Russia has made no compromises itself in the interest of promoting peace, citing a lack of territorial concessions, no moves toward a ceasefire, and no deadlines for de-escalation. Given the limited options, Williams suggests that the only credible security guarantee would be generally replicating the ambitious Korean DMZ, demilitarized zone, used to divide the two Koreas when the Armistice Agreement was signed in 1953. While acknowledging a Ukrainian DMZ would be longer, he believes an approximately 4-kilometer width would be reasonable, and that sensors, drones, and other surveillance capabilities would reduce the requirement for a large peacekeeping force. Also, a US Air Force officer, a former command pilot, instructor, and Bronze Star recipient, and a professor in the National Security Affairs Department of the US Naval War College, Lieutenant Colonel Jahara Matasek, supports the idea. In his November 2024 interview with Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty, he called it not the best, but the most realistic approach.
It will essentially create a huge DMZ, demilitarized zone, essentially between Ukraine and Belarus, Russia, and the occupied parts of Ukraine. And that would just basically be millions of landmines and Ukrainian defense bases, with probably European Union flag forces essentially as observers, peacekeepers, and as a part of that sort of deterrent line. It would essentially become just one big tripwire deterrent, if you will. That would be an ideal outcome for a lot of countries, especially in Europe.
As Kyiv Post has learned from diplomatic sources, the DMZ proposal has recently been a central component of the Trump administration's broader promise to end the war. The concept, which has been floated with European officials since early summer, is part of a series of scenarios being considered by the administration to swiftly end the conflict. A demilitarized zone, DMZ, is a designated area between hostile parties where military installations, activities, and personnel are forbidden by treaty or agreement. A Russia-Ukraine DMZ would involve a substantial strip of territory, possibly kilometers wide, where all military operations are prohibited, patrolled by a neutral force, and would span across potentially hazardous terrain like minefields and damaged cities, creating a heavily fortified security barrier to prevent renewed conflict. The New York Times reports that US officials are planning to propose an armistice for Ukraine, allegedly similar to how the Korean War ended in 1953. However, an armistice agreement like the Korean one does not align with Russia's goals and probably can't be achieved if limited to a ceasefire. As diplomatic sources familiar with the matter point out, a comparison with the Korean Peninsula helps to understand the scope of the project, which is still at an early stage. An armed truce has been in place there for more than 70 years, backed by a permanent international presence. Replicating that model would mean establishing a security corridor hundreds of kilometers long in Eastern Europe, with multinational observation posts and rules of engagement hammered out at the negotiating table. Yet the differences are significant. There would be no permanent American bases, but rather a hybrid arrangement with European troops on the ground and US technology in support. Such a solution would at least partly ease Russian objections to yet another formal NATO expansion, and it would reduce the number of personnel required on the ground. The plan would effectively freeze the conflict, allowing Russia to retain control of occupied Ukrainian territory. In return, Ukraine would be pressured to formally renounce its ambition to join NATO for at least 2 decades. The enforcement of the DMZ, a critical sticking point, would be left to European forces, with the US providing only intelligence and air defense support. As US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff explained, the guarantees would not come from NATO or from individual governments, but from a multilateral agreement that combines European troops, US deterrence, and an advanced digital framework. For Kyiv, such a solution might mean real protection. For Washington, it would mean the ability to defend the European order without creating lasting divisions. For Europe, it would offer a chance to prove both political unity and military capacity, supported by tools that reduce risks and uncertainty. However, Ukraine has consistently rejected any notion of territorial concessions. Earlier in May, President Volodymyr Zelensky, as per European Pravda, termed the DMZ proposal a dead idea, as he said.
The issue of a demilitarized zone of 15 kilometers in both directions. And why 15? And from which line will we count? From the border? From which contact line? Even if we talk about 15 kilometer, what will we do with Kherson? This means that there will be no our troops in Kherson. If there will be no our troops in Kherson, we will not have Kherson.
Kyiv argues that it would not lead to lasting peace, but would instead leave Ukrainian cities vulnerable to Russian artillery. The presence of Ukrainian forces in Russia's southern Kursk region also complicates the notion of a fixed border. European leaders also share this wariness, Western diplomats told Kyiv Post. They are concerned that the plan would legitimize Russian aggression and undermine international law. Unlike the North Korea and South Korea armistice, the Ukraine issue is territorial, military, and political. Russia annexed Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson provinces in September 2022 and Crimea in 2014. While the borders of Crimea are generally well recognized, the borders of the 4 provinces are not so clear. Based on the official Ukrainian oblast designations, Russia does not fully control any of these territories, and fighting is going on as the Russian army appears to be aiming at occupying as much territory as possible before negotiations start. Assuming that a deal could be made on borders, there are a host of questions that are more complicated. Among them are the rights of citizens on both sides of any demarcation line, trade between Ukraine and Russia, whether key utilities can be restored and utilized, such as the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power complex, water supply to Crimea from Ukraine, the status of ports and port and storage facilities on the Black Sea, the status of military ports on the Black Sea and Sea of Azov, the location of long-range weapons, and the presence of NATO forces on Ukraine's soil. Additional issues include the status of Ukraine's armed forces, Ukraine's membership in the EU and NATO, types of security guarantees, oil and gas transit, and related sanctions on Russia. When the Korean armistice was signed in 1953, United Nations forces were stationed in South Korea, and Chinese volunteers were in the north. Ukraine is different. Officially, there are no NATO forces, strictly defined, in Ukraine, although the Russian army is in Ukraine. Numerous reports say that several NATO countries, UK, France, and even Germany, are preparing to send troops to Ukraine when an armistice is agreed and to offer Ukraine security guarantees. One problem is that an armistice monitoring force and an armistice military deployment that would provide security guarantees to Ukraine are not the same thing. Russia's war objectives include not only recognition of the annexed areas, but the demilitarization of Ukraine and an agreement that Ukraine will not become a NATO member. Whether this includes security guarantees with major NATO countries is not clear. It is hard to see how an armistice agreement could be concluded without addressing these issues.